Hello and good afternoon. My name is Dan Wagner, and let me encourage those of you who wish to get closer and grab another cookie, or after my introductory remarks, I have the pleasure of introducing Jenny C. Aker today with us. As some of you know, a number of us, faculty and students, were able to get funding from the provost at the university to organize a series of speakers in the area of information and communication technologies and development. So since last fall and through this year, we have been inviting a series of speakers who are involved in one way or another in the area of ICT 4D, as we call it. Information Communications Technologies and Development. And this year, due to the press of other intensive activities that lasted into the early fall, this, I believe, is our first speaker, and first and mostest speaker of the fall. We will also have speakers we're lining them up for the spring. So Jenny Aker, who I had the pleasure of meeting at other events earlier on, is Assistant Professor of Economics at the Fletcher School at Tufts University. She's also a non-resident fellow at the Center for Global Development in Washington. We just discovered another common linkage, among others, that she worked as the Deputy Regional Director of Catholic Relief Services in West and Central Africa for, it looks like, about 5 years from 1998 to 2003. I mentioned that. I know there's some students here from the International Education Development Program. Catholic Relief Services, CRS, is one of the very prominent players and nonprofits in the world, and of course very active in Africa. On the blurb that was sent out, you can see that she did her PhD at University of California-Berkeley in agricultural economics, and these days is working on economic development in Africa, and also the impact of information and information technology on development outcomes, which I believe is the basis for the talk that she will present today. So we're delighted to have her here. Let's give a warm welcome to Jenny Aker.
Well, good afternoon. I know it's towards the end of the semester, so I appreciate that you've all come. And it's really an honor for me to be here today talking about this. Number one, because I feel very passionately about this topic, and number two, because I really want to have a discussion about the potential, but also the potential pitfalls of information technology and development in sub-Saharan Africa. So with that in mind, I invite you to answer questions as I go throughout it, because I think it will be a more interesting discussion. You don't want me to talk for the next 50 minutes, because then I'll start speaking at warp speed and it would get a little bit boring, right? So,
and I should say, pardon me,
yes,
that it's about 45, 50 minutes, and then we'll stay in for 15 to 30 minutes, depending on the amount of discussion. But you
Great.
Said that you're happy.
I'm happy to take questions.
Raise hands along the way, so don't hesitate.
So what I'm going to do today is that I'm not going to focus on a kind of information technology in a particular country. I thought it might be more useful to look at a survey of the way in which mobile phone technology in particular is affecting economic development in Africa. And with that in mind, I thought I would just set the stage a little bit and talk about mobile phone coverage and adoption in sub-Saharan Africa over the course of the past decade. Then I wanted to look at some of these policy and field experiments. I'll define those a little bit and see whether or not they really are kind of making life better for some of the world's poor. We need to talk a little bit about the flip side as well. What evidence do we have that the introduction of some of these technologies might be having negative repercussions? And then I would like to talk a little bit about the way forward and talking about the private sector, the public sector, and how they can maybe potentially work together to really harness the potential for this technology. So I think it's been pretty widely recognized that information technology, in particular mobile phones, are transforming markets in low-income countries faster than ever imagined. And this effect is particularly dramatic in the rural areas of sub-Saharan Africa, where we could argue that mobile phone infrastructure is one of the first modern infrastructures that were introduced in many areas of any kind. Now, what do I mean by modern infrastructure? Well, if you talk about the 12 million residents of Niger, where I do a lot of my work, Back in 2001, they had about 20,000 landlines. That's 2 landlines available for every 1,000 people before mobile phones were actually introduced in 2001. Similarly, as might be evident here, Africa has the lowest density of paved roads in the world. Out of the 2 million kilometers of roads on the continent, only about 29% of those are paved. And finally, sub-Saharan Africa only has about 1% of the global electricity capacity, and about 80% of that is taken by North Africa and South Africa combined. Now, despite the fact that there's been more limited investments in power, roads, and landline over the course of the past 40 or 50 years, mobile phone infrastructure has grown quite dramatically over the course of the past decade. And what I'd like to show you here is this map that in white shows electricity coverage, in brown shows GSM towers, mobile phone towers, and you can see about, a little over 10 years ago, the concentration was primarily in Morocco and also in South Africa. If you fast forward that 10 years, you see that mobile phone coverage not only overtakes, but kind of greatly exceeds electricity coverage. What this basically represents is 11.2 million square kilometers that's covered by mobile phones. That represents an area of the US and Argentina combined. And if you just don't look at kind of area, but you look at the population, in 1999, about 10% of the population of sub-Saharan Africa had access to mobile phone coverage. Now, what I'm saying is that you lived in an area where you could actually get a signal. That increased to about 60% of the population in 2009. That represents about 477 million people. Now, kind of these increases in mobile phone coverage have also coincided with increases in mobile phone adoption and usage. So it's not just that the infrastructure is being built and people aren't using that. And I think that that's really fascinating because if you look at kind of the number of consumers that are in sub-Saharan Africa, almost 1 billion, 30% of that population is living on less than $1 a day. About half of those people are living on less than 50 cents a day. They're termed the ultra poor. And yet kind of mobile phone adoption and usage has been quite dramatic, and it's been coinciding with this increase in mobile phone coverage. And what you see here is basically, on the y-axis is the number of mobile phone subscribers. That's whether or not you have a SIM card, and we can talk about all of the problems with this data. In 2000, there were about 16 million subscribers. In 2008, that went up to 376 million subscribers. That's about 30% of the population. Now, obviously, there are problems with this data because what this is measuring is how many SIM cards are being used. Well, this could totally overestimate the number of actual users because one person can own multiple SIM cards. I personally own 4 SIM cards for Niger, 2 for Mozambique, 2 for Ghana. So I'm going into these figures, right? You can see how that would overestimate it. At the same point in time, it could also underestimate actual usage or the benefits of mobile phones because just because I might have a mobile phone, I can then share it with members of my family. I can share it with other people within the village. And in fact, there was a study that came out by Wireless Intelligence, I think in the last 2 weeks, that said if you look at the number of unique individual mobile phone subscribers, one individual who owns at least a SIM card, not double counting these SIM cards, it was only about 356 million people, but still that's 30% of the population. And given the figures that I just told you, living on less than 50 cents a day, that's quite substantial because these SIM cards can cost between 50 cents and $1. Now that's a one-time fixed cost, but still this kind of shows the potential for using this technology. Yes, sir?
Is there a data point using the same metric in terms of SIM cards?
Yeah. And what they try to do is because now, since 2009 and 2010, many countries have implemented a new policy that says that you actually have to have some type of, you have to show your passport or some type of ID to register for a SIM card, which was not the case before 2008 and 2009. So it becomes much easier to track people. It becomes much harder to also get access to these SIM cards. But there have been many countries throughout sub-Saharan Africa that have implemented this, which makes it much easier to track who is buying SIM cards and avoid kind of double counting. There's still going to be a lot of measurement error, though.
When you talk later about why there's this drop, I would have expected the other direction.
Because what they were doing here is that they were basically double counting. So, sorry, these figures in 2008 was when they were double counting everyone. So if you had 2 or 3 mobile phone SIM cards, you were in that figure. Then they went back and they said, let's not double count. We're just going to count individuals who own at least 1 SIM card. And that's why we see that it seems as if this previous figure might have been overestimating kind of at least SMS or SIM card ownership. So it's not that it went down, it's just that before I think we were overestimating subscriptions, but we could still think about the fact that one person can share the mobile phone with multiple people so the benefits can accrue to several different individuals. Did you have another question?
Well, it's Why the magic 2? Why?
What do you mean, why the magic 2?
There's an assumption, right? 2008, there's an assumption this is a double count.
Right.
Why 2 and not 3, not 2.5?
Oh, so what they basically did when they looked at this recent study is that they said that on average people are owning about 1.9 SIM cards. Let's just call it 2, right? Whatever. So I think that what they actually did is because you had this registration, they were able to see the number of SIM cards that each individual owned, and then for each individual calculate the average that were owned. I don't, but there's going to be problems with these. I think this shows the trend, but we want to be careful about what we can say about these figures and how we can actually use them. But I think that the interesting thing here is that, given the fact that there's been this widespread increase in mobile phone coverage and adoption, there are some of these figures. There's also been a lot of excitement by policymakers, by journalists, by the mobile phone companies themselves about the potential for mobile phones. And if you look back at what Paul Kagame said, and who's made a lot of investments in information technology, he was basically said in 10 short years, what was once an object of luxury and privilege has now become a basic necessity. That was something that was echoed by The Economist in 2008 and more recently in 2011. And I work with a lot of grain traders in Niger and as farmers as well. And basically what they will say is, now with a cell phone in record time, I have all sorts of information. I can just pick up the phone and call people rather than physically traveling to these markets. Now, the mobile phone companies have gotten quite excited about the potential for mobile phones in development as well. If you look at a lot of their slogans, they provide this promise that you're going to have a better life for those who use it. And I like some of these slogans because Orange says, together we can do more. Zain, that was bought out by Bhartiya Airtel, said, we'll have a wonderful life. And Vodacom says, tout de bon, which is, all is good. If you have our phone, all is going to be good. And I'm not making fun of them, but I want us to look at these statements and slogans that we see in the press and really ask the question, do we think that mobile phone technology is improving people's levels of well-being? Are people in developing countries actually better off because of mobile phones? Now, I've highlighted the things here because this is a very broad question, and we'd like to have the answer to that question, but obviously we need to narrow it down. First of all, who are we talking about when we're talking about people? Are we talking about the rich or the poor? Are we talking about consumers, producers, traders? Secondly, when we're talking about better off, how are we measuring this metric of welfare? As economists, we love GDP or, something about income or expenditures, and that might not necessarily be the right metric for us to be measuring well-being. Thirdly, when you're talking about mobile phones, are we talking about simple handsets? Are we talking about smartphones? Are we talking about wireless? Are we talking about broadband? And finally, the key issue here is really going to be because. So if you're a policymaker and you have to invest a limited amount of your dollars in future projects, you want to know that if you're investing in ICT for development, it's actually going to work. It's going to improve people's lives more than the traditional way of doing things, which might not have involved ICT, and it's going to be for lower cost. And these are hard questions to be asking and things that we need the answers to in order to make some of these really tough policy decisions. And so what I'd like to do is look at some of the policy and field experiments we've done and that we've seen throughout the world to try and get a better handle on the impacts of mobile phones on economic development, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa. We can focus on, I think, two separate channels, or obviously they're going to be related. The first one is just that the private sector has come in, they've built these mobile phone towers, they build other types of infrastructure, and we see what happens. We see how that affects people's lives. How are people using it? The second is that the public sector and other types of agencies actually incorporate information technology into their way of doing business as a way of providing services and information in the hopes that this is going to be lowering costs and potentially increasing the benefits. So if we start a little bit looking at the first one and just thinking through channels of impact, and maybe you guys would have some additional channels of impact that you could have, I think that the big thing about mobile phones is that they quite simply reduce the costs of communicating information over long distances, which is really huge. Now you can call up members of your social network, you can remain in contact with people more frequently. That's super important when you think of the other market failures that exist. So if you don't have insurance markets, if you don't have credit markets, if you don't necessarily have health insurance, you need to rely upon members of your social network in order to help you out. And if you have a member of your social network who's gone to Nigeria and someone at home is sick, the fact that you can pick up the phone and call them and tell them or ask them to send you money now rather than waiting for 2 months from now can have a really huge impact. Secondly, and related to this reduction in communication costs, the fact that it's less costly to communicate with other individuals, either in your social network or your professional network, just quite simply reduces the costs of searching for information. Now, information isn't everything. I mean, I think what we've seen now with the internet is that sometimes we're inundated by way too much information, but information is extremely important. You need information on agricultural prices, on kind of labor markets, on natural shocks, on health, in order to make decisions about where you should sell and buy, where you should go and search for a job. And if it's easier to get that information, then it's going to improve market efficiency. The third thing is that, by allowing us to have better access to this information, it could potentially improve coordinations between buyers and sellers. That's going to be important because if you think about a market woman who's living in northern Ghana, who might be kind of selling a particular commodity, she's running out of the stock and her supplier is living in Accra, which is about 700 kilometers away. Beforehand, she would have had to have planned in advance in order to order it, in order to avoid some type of costly stock out. And if you have a stock out, then people are going to go to someone else and you can lose your customers. And now you could potentially pick up the phone, call, say in about 2 or 3 days, I'm going to need this. If your supplier can't give it to you, you contact someone else. And this can really improve a lot of productivity. The last two things I think that we can think of is that mobile phones have the potential for generating employment, especially in sub-Saharan Africa. I think that this is very specific to the fact that most of sub-Saharan Africa has relied upon the prepaid system. So, rather than having our cursed 2-year contract with AT&T, who I can't even be in my apartment and talk on my mobile phone, which is ridiculous, right? And I can't get out of my contract. What you do is that you go and buy a SIM card, and this is getting back to the idea of having multiple SIM cards, and so you can switch between operators, which one is going to be less costly. What this has necessitated is having a huge infrastructure out into remote rural areas where people can kind of buy SIM cards, buy airtime, repair their mobile phones, and so there's a potential here for actually generating employment. The final thing is nothing to do with employment or communication, but it links with the introduction of this new service, which is called mobile money. So I'll talk a little bit about this, but basically it allows you to kind of send money via your mobile phones, make and receive money transfers. This could potentially reduce transaction costs and facilitate service delivery if you have insurance or credit and inputs. I think this could be quite useful. I've been trying to spend the past 2 days sending money to Eastern Congo via Western Union, and I hate Western Union right now. Sorry if anyone works for Western Union. But so I think that this offers a kind of a really important opportunity because it allows people to use an alternative means of money transfer. And so if you look at these, I'm just going to be focusing on the 5 channels of impact rather than the 6th one. I think it can also reduce data collection costs, where we seem to have evidence. Kind of policy and also field experiments has been in the 2 that I've really highlighted here, the reduction of search costs and kind of the use of mobile money transfer systems. Yes, yeah.
Could you cycle back just to that initial question that you had better off?
Yeah.
Was that, or what was that question again?
So are people in developing countries better off because of mobile phones?
And when you said better off, did you define that for us?
I didn't define that, right? Because that's going to be depending upon kind of how we believe what our metric for better welfare should be. So as an economist, we will often say, I'm going to be looking at some measure of income or expenditures or asset ownership. It could also be more subjective levels of well-being. Someone else might.
So I was just tracking, because this, just to make sure I understood it, so the channels of impact here are related to the definition of better off.
Yes.
Because
right.
you could have had, are people happier?
Yes.
And then you have a different set of channels.
Yes, right.
You can see a little photograph of your nephew.
Yes, right.
Happier,
Yeah,
not better off.
right.
Economically.
Right, and so that first one, like the improved communication among social networks, the way I framed it was, in a very economic sense, which is you can communicate, you don't have insurance, you don't have credit, but you might just, yeah, you're right, but you might just be happy to talk to that person. And in fact, in Niger, among many of our surveys, when we say, have you used the mobile phone? They said, it's just to say hi. How you doing? I mean, nothing that is directly related to an economic purpose, at least for that kind of transaction. That being said, there's kind of repeated interactions because obviously we depend upon each other. We're family members. I'm always happy to hear from you, but I also know that by keeping in contact with you in the future, you might help me out. But yes, you could frame this in a different way that's just going to be focusing on a different set of channels. So I don't know if you would always, the channels that I want you guys to think about here is like communication and service delivery. Like that's basically what mobile phones can do, right? So it makes kind of communicating less expensive. So if it makes communicating less expensive, you could then see how that's going to go up through the chain and see whether it might have other sociological impacts, demographic impacts, health impacts. You can make the same argument here for agriculture, for health, for things that are not specifically so narrowly defined as economic, and we'll talk a little bit about education. And the second thing that it can do is kind of provide services now that you have the advent of mobile money, specifically money transfer services, which I think is more directly linked to economics. So that's why it's often difficult when we talk about the development or the impact of mobile phones. Communication can mean so many things. And I'm defining it in a very kind of narrow economic sense, which is, can we have some tangible measure of income or expenditures or assets? But that does not preclude measuring its impact on other channels as well, broadening your social network or narrowing it.
So if you excuse me,
Yeah.
prompted me to think, of course, outside the box.
Yeah.
And just because we may lose it, I would raise this later, but it's so pertinent to this one. I was thinking of the case which you must have experienced in Niger about simply the social prestige of people having 2 or 3 phones on the desk in front of them when they're in a meeting. Right? So that isn't about communication or about service delivery, it's about prestige. It's not the kind of car you park in front. Not to say that that's what we have to be looking at. But of course, if you broaden what it means to be better off, then we start considering a broader array.
And other people will talk about this specifically if you can download different types of ringtones or you can play certain types of games. And that's a whole debate about whether or not that should be done. And so yes, I'm being narrow here, but I still think that the 2 channels of, mainly kind of communication and service delivery are going to hold. But now maybe this idea of like providing content and games could be the third one now that we're going into that sphere. But I'm not going to talk too much about that. But we can talk about that, yeah. So I wanted to talk a little bit about, sorry, was there another question? Yes, Monroe.
So this goes back to our conversation. Is improving the capacity of government to serve the population a channel of impact? In other words, going back to your question, does improved government a measure of making people better off?
Yes, I believe so. And so I didn't really talk about the last one, which is this data collection cost and improved accountability. So that's going to be huge. That can be a governmental organization, the private sector, disseminating that information. It can also be the third one, which I said coordination between buyers and sellers, but that could be between kind of, remote areas or, if you have decentralization. So I focused a little bit more on the micro, but governance is going to be a huge one here, right? And you could we should be thinking about that. Yes?
In terms of facilitating service delivery, I would include the mobile medic.
Yeah, that's true.
That does improve the quality of health.
Yeah.
So they are better off in terms of health because of that.
Yeah, I'm going to write some of these down because they're so interesting. And I think that part of it is here, we'll talk a little bit, what these channels are focusing on is, if the private sector comes in and offers these services, offers these infrastructures, this is usually the channels of impact that we've seen. Now then what happens is usually the public sector, in some cases the private sector, take that a step further and develop these services that can specifically have a development goal. And that what I would argue is when you're looking at mobile medic, when you're looking at mobile health services, when you're looking at these agricultural services, sometimes the private sector is doing that on their own, but their bread and butter is usually tower, voice, SMS, and these are kind of the channels that we'll see. But then this gets back to your and Monroe's point, is that you can build upon that and have other impacts as well. So if we talk a little bit, I'd just like to talk about these 2 for a minute before we get into some of these field experiments, this idea of kind of reducing search costs. And I'd like to kind of focus on a very specific example. So this is a trader that I met, Abdoulaye, who lives in eastern Niger. And he basically is kind of trading millet and sorghum, which are the staple grains, as well as cowpea. He lives in this market called Bakken-Birji, and what used to happen is that he could either sell in that market where he was based, or he could travel around to different markets where he would first want to find out the price before he decided whether or not he was going to sell there. Now that not only required the opportunity cost of his time, which is about 1 to 3 hours depending on where you went, but it obviously kind of required transport costs as well. And then when mobile phones were started to be introduced in Niger in 2001, but really rolled out between 2004 and 2008, what he could then do is pick up the phone, kind of call members of his social network in these markets, which allowed him to kind of get this price information at a fraction of the cost. And secondly, it allowed him to call a market that was much farther away, Niamey, which is the capital market. It's about 800, 900 kilometers away, where he never would have traveled before to get this price information. And all of a sudden, it kind of reduced the cost of him getting this price information. It made it much easier for him to decide where he was going to sell, to kind of look for a higher price, and then actually sell his goods in that market. Now, what that means at the broader level, kind of from an economic perspective, if you just want to give me a little bit of a moment where we're talking about this, is that if you kind of have trade, or there's no trade between these two areas, if you have a very low production zone where prices are going to be really high, you have a very high production zone where prices are going to be really low, well, then the price differences between those two markets are obviously going to be kind of quite great. But as soon as you have access to information, it's easy to get access to that information. There can be trade that's occurring between those two markets. Price differences are going to go down between those two markets because there's arbitrage, and this basically improves market efficiency. And there's been a bunch of studies that have taken advantage of or kind of observed this policy experiment, which is the introduction of mobile phones throughout markets within a particular country, and tried to kind of assess the impact of the introduction of mobile phone coverage on agricultural prices, but also on labor markets. So the most famous one is done by Rob Jensen in India. I've done some work on this in grain markets in Niger. There's been a lot of other work done in India with soybean prices, and in Uganda, there's been a separate body of research that's looked at labor markets. Let me just kind of give you the punchline of what most of these people have seen. I'm not going to show you this, but basically what they're trying to do is, if you introduce a mobile phone tower, which I've circled here, how does that affect markets, whether price levels or price differences? And if we see a reduction in prices, or we see a reduction in price differences across markets, is it really due to mobile phones, or is it due to something else? Because if it's due to something else, we don't want to make a policy decision thinking that if we build mobile phone towers, we're going to see the same results. And what a lot of these guys find, and I think this is just the nicest one, you might have already seen this before, is that these basically show kind of different prices in fish markets that are about 15 kilometers apart. They're about a 15-kilometer radius away from each other. And so all of those squiggly lines just basically shows that, fish prices were quite different, even though those markets were pretty close to each other. The red line is when mobile phones were introduced in those markets. So as soon as the red line, mobile phones were introduced, what do you see? Fish prices almost go to the law of one price. So now, people were able to call around, they figured out where there was high demand, low demand, and reallocate their sales based upon that information, which is pretty astounding. I did a study like that as well, where we found similar results, but we found that for a millet, which is a grain, which is storable. And overall, these studies that we've seen find that once mobile phone towers are introduced, markets improve. And this is being measured by the fact that price differences across markets go down. But the magnitude of that effect really depends upon the type of product, the market structure, whether or not there's other market failures. And getting back to kind of Dan's question, the overall welfare improves with more efficient markets. Here, welfare being measured by some type of kind of price levels or the income derived from my sales. But how that's distributed among consumers, producers, and traders is ambiguous. So there are winners and losers. So overall, the market is doing better. Economics never said that we would have equity. We said we would have efficiency. So that's what's happening. But there's going to be some winners and losers for all of these studies. If you go to kind of the second facilitation or the second policy experiment, which is the introduction of mobile money services, well, I think that this has been quite interesting for those of you who might not know about mobile money services. It basically involves a series of transactions where you can kind of transfer money via your mobile phone. So this is based upon some posters that we did with a project in Niger, where if I have $5 in my pocket, I go to a local agent, he puts that $5 on my mobile phone. I can then use a series of PIN codes to send that $5 to someone else who might be about 800 or 900 kilometers away. They get a little beep on their mobile phone that says you received $5. I go to another local agent who's in my village. He gives me the $5, or I can just go to a local shopkeeper. So it allows for this domestic money transfer, but it can also allow for international money transfers. Yeah.
I'm interested if there have been any studies that compare percentages that are withdrawn from transfers via MoneyGram, Western Union versus these money transfers. Like how much is being misappropriated let's say if remittances are being sent via money transfer, like in Kenya or popular places, Somali communities, like how much is actually not getting
Reaching.
Reaching. Is this advantageous or is it convenient?
Right. It's a good question. So, I mean, if you look at the actual costs of Western Union via the bus, via mobile money. So mobile money is less expensive, per kind of the $10 that you were to send. If you ask people what they think about mobile money, it's convenient usually, and there's a perception, at least what we've seen in Kenya, in parts of Nigeria, in parts of Tanzania, there's a perception that it's definitely safer than putting it on the bus, or maybe have someone send it for you. Now, the third thing that you're asking is, if I send the money, could the agent just say, well, you only received $20, and in fact, you received $25, and then you lose that $5. And up until now, there hasn't been anything that's actually compared kind of the two mechanisms to see whether or not people are losing out more with one mechanism than the other. I'm going to talk a little bit about a field experiment we did in Niger where we used mobile money as part of a cash transfer system. In that case, kind of the uptake or the loss or the leakage was extremely low, but we also had to do a lot of work in order to ensure that people knew the amount that they were getting, what they were supposed to get, so that they were aware and they could actually say, no, you were supposed to give me $20 rather than $25. So the potential's there, but I don't know whether it's going to be more or less compared with like Western Union or MoneyGram. Yeah.
If it was low, like is it below, let's say, 10 to 12%?
In our case, it was below like 2%. But when we talk about it, we all, the organization that we worked with had to do a substantial amount of work to ensure that it only was 2%. And if you were just sending money, privately without working through an organization and no one is informing you of the amount that's actually sent, then the potential for leakage could be much higher. That being said, I don't know if it's going to be higher or lower again as compared to Western Union and MoneyGram, and I haven't seen anything. But it definitely is cheaper in terms of the cost, and it's often perceived to be at least more secure. But for Western Union and MoneyGram as compared with mobile money, I think what I've seen is that they're often kind of viewed as the same way. So just to give you an idea of kind of mobile money, it's the most famous kind of mobile money program is in Kenya. Everyone's heard about M-Pesa in Kenya. It's the thing that everyone refers to. Also GCash in the Philippines. There are 80 mobile money programs throughout the world. And the reason that kind of this has been touted as a potential tool for international development has been because a significant percentage of the world's poor are unbanked. They have limited access to formal financial services, so often have to rely upon kind of social networks or money lenders. The cost of transferring money can be quite high. We talked a little bit about the mechanisms, and if you compare the cost in Kenya, sending it via M-Pesa as compared to the post office and the bus, it was quite substantially less expensive. The issue there is, though, Kenya has a lot of agents, which is really nice. And, basically a lot of money is being sent by M-Pesa in Kenya. But I would argue that actually Kenya is the outlier here. It's not kind of the norm of where this is actually happening. There's been 2 studies that have looked at these policy experiments, the impact of mobile money on well-being. And here well-being is being defined as kind of consumption or income or expenditures. Are people able to respond to shocks? The first one was done looking at kind of the Rwandan earthquake of 2008. So there was an earthquake in Rwanda, all the way to the west of the country. And what they did is, this is a precursor to mobile money. They observed whether or not people were transferring airtime via mobile phones. And so were people living in other areas of the country actually sending money via the mobile phone to those who were affected by the earthquake? And they found out that they basically were. They weren't sending very much. It was about kind of $84 during that time, but that's quite significant in today's terms. This was even before the advent of the formal mobile money system. But in this case, those who were actually sending it were those who were wealthier. Those were more social contacts. A similar study was done in Kenya, where they found that those who had access to mobile money faced a 7% reduction in consumption when faced with shocks. But those with access to mobile money were able to smooth consumption. So, if I had a shock, a health shock or an agricultural shock, my consumption went down. But those who faced a similar shock and had access to mobile money were able to receive money from their friends and family members and didn't experience this kind of reduction in consumption. So that's kind of the 2 types of policy experiments, at least in economics, that we've seen. One really focusing on access to information, market efficiency. The second set really focusing on kind of mobile money and using it as a transfer system. Now, I think that a lot of the excitement and what we've been talking about a little bit here is the fact that since we've seen some evidence that mobile phones might be making markets more efficient, they might be allowing people to smooth consumption, there's been, I would argue, a proliferation of mobile phone-based development projects. And we did a little bit of a survey last year for Google, and it's just kind of surprising about how many there actually are, even in places that you wouldn't expect there to be kind of a high proliferation of mobile phone-based development projects. And if you're looking at them, and we talked about this a little bit earlier, I mean, they cut across all of the sectors, you know, again, using them as a communication device, using them to send out information for health, for governance, for agriculture, for education. They're using different types of information technology, radio, mobile, computer. They're providing different types of services, collecting data, disseminating information, providing a monetary transfer, and then they're basing it on voice or SMS. And so, you know, you can kind of look at every single country, specifically in sub-Saharan Africa, and find an example, at least, of one of these projects. The big kind of issue for us is, I think, for people that are sitting in this room, is that if we're doing all these projects, are they actually helping people? Right? So there's often kind of a sense or maybe a little bit of a worry that, you know, mobile technology is cool, information technology is cool, so let's do something that involves mobile phones. And that's fine, but I think that one of the things that we're trying to do through some of our, what I'm going to call these field experiments, are trying to ask ourselves the questions, you know, are mobile phones actually improving people's levels of well-being as compared to the traditional way of doing things, and are they more cost effective? And so a lot of programs, traditionally when I worked for CRS, we would collect program information on program recipients before and after the program. That's great. You know, if people's incomes went up after this mobile phone-based agriculture project, we would often say, the project worked, but maybe it had nothing to do with us. Maybe it had something to do with the fact that the economy got better, that prices went up in general. And so for a lot of these projects, we really want to be asking ourselves the question, what's the impact of M development on well-being? So first of all, we have to define well-being, which is going to, I think, depend specifically on the sector and the project. Secondly, we want to ask ourselves the question, if we see any changes in well-being, is this due to this project or is it due to something else? And in order for us to answer this question, we really have to find a control group, in many cases a group that is not participating in the M development project, so that we can kind of compare whether or not overall things are better. The second issue, I think, with a lot of these M development projects is that we have to disentangle the impact of the mobile phone from the service that's provided. So some of these projects will actually distribute mobile phones. Well, the mobile phone itself can result in some benefits, and then you might be providing information or services via that mobile phone. And so it's important to disentangle that, because not every single project on a large scale is going to be distributing mobile phones, nor should they be distributing mobile phones. And so if that's not the model that we're looking at, we want to really understand the impact. And then we want to say, well, even if people are better off, is it more expensive? Is it much more expensive? Because we might have limited development dollars. And are there any kind of positive or even negative impacts on non-project participants? So Jenna Burrell, who's out at UC Berkeley, has done some interesting work about the social dynamics of people who do have mobile phones and don't have mobile phones, and how this changes social networks and could potentially improve social networks along one dimension, but destroy social networks along another dimension. And then we want to ask ourselves the questions, if we were going to do this someplace else, would it work? Or is this just our particular context? And so I just wanted to briefly share results from two of the projects I've been working on. But we've done a few of them. Basically, we did one that's using mobile phones as an education tool. The second one was using the mobile money capability for a cash transfer program. The third one was using mobile phones as part of civic education. And the final one was using mobile phones to provide market information. I'm just going to basically focus on the education one and the mobile money one, but I'm happy to talk about the other ones if there's kind of time at the end. So let me talk a little bit about this project, which is called Project ABC, Alphabétisation de base par cellulaire, which means literacy by cell phone in French. We were all excited as a team because it took us 2 days to come up with that, and we thought it was really smart. And basically, this is based upon kind of this observation that, you know, education is extremely important for development. Yet kind of education rates are extremely low in many countries throughout the world. There's about 880 million adults worldwide who aren't able to read and write in any language. And if you look at these education indicators, particularly adult literacy rates, They're extremely low in West Africa. Niger and Mali have 2 of the lowest adult literacy rates in the entire region. And the question here is really kind of why. So there's a lot of work that's been done, especially with primary school children, getting those kids into school. You know, how can we increase enrollment? But the big question is that once you get kids into school, how do you improve learning? And there doesn't seem to be kind of a very clear answer to this. Secondly, I used to work for an organization. We focused a lot on primary education, which is great and super important, but there's very kind of little focus on adult education programs. And the adult education programs that do exist are often kind of plagued by high dropout rates, kind of high skills depreciation. And if we really want to have sustained improvements in adult literacy, the key question is, how can this be improved? Yeah.
I'm interested in the Mali and the Niger focus. So if you're using, for example, the ABC project, are you focusing on creating content in Hausa or in Bambara or in languages that are more accessible? And like particularly in the case of like Mali and Niger, where houses are more spread out, you know, and a cell phone could actually be an isolated educational tool. Like, do you have a team that's focused on local language?
So I'll talk a little bit about that, but everything here is local language first. So the whole adult education curriculum is you learn in your local language. And then after a 2 or 3 year period, if you wanted to transition into another language, you could, but everything is Hausa, Zarma, Fulani, Bambara. And I'll talk a little bit about that. During this phase of the project, we didn't do content, but during our second phase of the project, we are doing content. So this project is, when computer scientists see this project, many of them cringe because it's so simple that there's no computer science involved, right? It's just, we didn't do anything special. And I think you could do a lot more than what we did, but we were really looking at a proof of concept. So let me talk a little bit about the idea for this, because I can't take credit for this idea. This idea came from, again, going back to kind of these grain traders. So if you go to the grain trader Abdullahi, about 70% of these grain traders are illiterate. They could not read or write. But as I said, they wanted to use mobile phones to get price information. So mobile phones, much cheaper than traveling to these markets. However, it was still at this time about $1 to $2 a minute, which is a lot, right? So you'd like pick up the phone, call and say like, what's the price, and like hang up, which is super impolite, right? So what they were saying is we would really like to text, because text was about 1/7 the price of calling. But if you don't know how to read and write, texting is very difficult. So they would ask a friend to say, you know, could you send this text to my friend in Hausa or Zarma, asking for the price. They would get back the message. They would ask their friend to read it. And between the first and second year of the survey, many of the traders were saying, well, I don't want to share this price information with my friend. I want the price information. So it created this incentive for them to learn themselves how to read and write. Recognize letters, recognize numbers, not complicated, but enough so that you could actually kind of send and receive SMS messages. And we thought that's the coolest thing ever, right? If people are learning how to read and write via mobile phones, maybe this could actually be used as an educational tool. And so we worked with Catholic Relief Services in this case, where we wanted to see whether or not, in fact, mobile phones could be used as an educational tool. We developed with the Ministry of Non-Formal Education and CRS a mobile phone module as part of their regular adult education program, and people were randomly assigned. I'll talk a little bit about that. And then we wanted to ask ourselves the question, well, if it really improved people's test scores, why? You know, is it because people were using it outside of class? Is it because it made them more excited about learning? What was really the mechanism here? And so the way that many of these adult education programs work in Niger, but also Mali and other areas of West Africa, in my experience, is there's about 8 months of an adult education class. It's held for a certain period of the year, so as not to conflict with the agricultural season. As we mentioned previously, it starts out in indigenous languages, here Hausa and Zarma. It's quite intense. It's 5 courses a week for 3 hours a day. So, I mean, you're really sitting there, and it's taught primarily by community literacy teachers. And there were 50 literacy participants per village, 25 men and 25 women. And so what we did as part of this adult education curriculum is that we developed a mobile phone curriculum, or a mobile phone module, which we called ABC. And all that this module did was teach people how to use mobile phones. There was no content whatsoever. That's the kind of our second phase, which is you learn how to turn it off and on, where to find letters and numbers, how to make and receive a call, how to send and receive an SMS. In this case, they were provided access to cell phones, so that basically 5 people shared a cell phone. And it didn't start right away. It started after you could recognize letters and numbers. So the key part of this was just, providing some visual aids. So this basically kind of shows the poster that was put up in many of these areas where people could see where these different buttons were, and this is written in Hausa. And we, as I said before, we kind of randomly assigned. How did we do that? Half the people got regular adult education, half the people got adult education plus a mobile phone. The whole idea here is that we wanted to see whether or not this mobile phone was better than doing things the traditional way. And if it was better, really why? So just to give you a little bit of the punchline, well, what we found out was, and this is kind of writing test scores, and I'll show it for math, that before the program, this goes from a level from 0 to 6. 0 is no letter or number recognition. The people who were chosen to participate were, for all purposes, kind of functionally illiterate. They couldn't recognize any letters or numbers. Immediately after the program, their test scores went up to the case where they could actually kind of write sentences, they could solve math problems, but in this case it's writing sentences. We see here that in black is those in the ABC program, in white is those in the regular adult education curriculum. So overall test scores were higher for those in the ABC program as compared to the non-ABC program. And if you went back in kind of 6 months later, there was this skills depreciation, so people were no longer or had lost some of their skills because they couldn't practice, but there was still kind of higher test scores in the ABC villages as compared with the non-ABC villages. So what this meant, and we saw the exact same thing for math. So the neat thing here is that just by virtue of the fact of learning how to use a mobile phone, people's test scores were about 20% higher in ABC villages than non-ABC villages, and even though our skills depreciated, they were still higher after the end of the program. Now the key question really here is why? And the main kind of reason that we actually saw this was that students were able to use mobile phones outside of classes. So they were able to continue practicing outside of the class. In the regular adult education program, what we saw was that once people learned how to read and write, they had very limited opportunities to practice. There weren't any reading and writing materials in Hausa or Zarma. So the only way that they could practice is if they went to the market or went to the health center. But with the mobile phone, they could send and receive SMS in their local languages with members of their family, which kept people learning. And when we looked at kind of how effective it was as well, what you basically see here, this shows how effective a variety of different educational interventions are in terms of improving learning, the most effective being these educational vouchers in Colombia. What you basically see is that kind of using this mobile phone-based module is actually pretty effective at getting people to learn. So the second thing I want to talk with just before, because I know we might be running out of time. Do I have to, how am I doing? Okay. Okay. It's just basically very quickly this mobile money cash transfer program. These cash transfers have been used in a lot of different countries. The way it's traditionally done when there aren't a lot of financial institutions is that it requires putting cash into small envelopes, actually then kind of taking this out into remote rural areas and distributing the cash. In many cases, that requires having the military go along with you so that it's actually not stolen, which can be quite expensive, but also raise questions about the separation of the public sector and the military. And so with the introduction of mobile money, particularly in Niger, this offered a new opportunity for different NGOs to actually distribute or make these cash transfer programs. And so what we wanted to do was see whether or not using mobile money as a way to make cash transfers actually reduce the costs, both for the implementing agency and for the program recipients, and whether or not it resulted in any other benefits for these program recipients. So I'm not going to go through kind of why you could potentially see these effects. I'm not going to go through too much of the intervention, but basically it was a very short-term intervention over a 5-month period. And again, we used this idea of a field experiment where some people received manual cash, some people received manual cash plus a mobile phone, and some people received the mobile phone plus the mobile money cash transfer system. And this allows us, again, to figure out whether or not it's mobile money that's causing the impact or it's actually the mobile phone handset. And so the kind of key takeaway message about what we found is that, number one, it was much more cost effective for the implementing agency, much cheaper for the implementing agency to use mobile money as compared to physically putting the cash in these envelopes and distribute it to these villages. Number two, and I would argue in some cases even more importantly, it was also much cheaper for the program recipients. So program recipients didn't have to travel as far to actually get their money, and that meant that they had to spend less time waiting for their money. And that is really important when you're looking at the opportunity costs of time, that can also be very important if you're in kind of highly insecure areas. And so what we found is that reduced costs, both for the implementing agency and for the program recipients, but there were also other benefits as well. I'm not going to go through all of those benefits, but the fact that mobile money was given to women and that women could kind of hide a little bit the fact that they had received this money changed the inter-household decision-making process. So women had more say in how the money was spent, because with manual cash, they got the money, everyone observed it, and with mobile money, they got a discreet little beep. They were able to say, okay, I'm going to tell my husband a little bit later this evening, and we'll talk about it, not in front of everyone else, and this had very clear, tangible benefits. So I'm not going to go into kind of some of the other things that we've talked about. I think that it is really important to think about some of these potential negative impacts, and I'm only going to go through that briefly. I'm not trying to kind of sweep them under the rug, but obviously anytime you have a reduce in kind of communication costs that not only can be used for good purposes and good objectives, but also for bad purposes and bad objectives. So we were talking about kind of the elections in Sierra Leone back in 2008. There were a variety of different text messages that were sent out saying things about particular ethnic groups, so it could be used also to disseminate hate speech. The nice thing about this is that once people found out about it, they were also able to counteract that hate speech right away and much more quickly. It could also have kind of effects in terms of social exclusion. There's always the question of environmental impacts, given the fact that most of these cell phone towers are running on diesel generators. I showed you the electricity map. There's not a lot of electricity that's generating these things. And then this is particularly really important here. There's the whole question of how coltan mining, coltan, which is extremely important for mobile phones, seems to be at least highly related to and potentially fueling the conflict in Eastern Congo. So these are things we don't want to forget. So just to kind of sum up, I think that what we've seen so far, at least from an economic perspective, is that mobile phones can improve at least market efficiency and increase welfare. I would argue, as some of the questions said, this is really a fraction of what we need to know, right? I've defined it very, very narrowly. And just because markets are more efficient doesn't mean that everyone gains. There are going to be some losers, and we want to ask ourselves the questions, who lost? Are they actually negatively affected? And what does this mean for poverty? Second, I think the big takeaway message is that it's not really clear that mobile phones are going to translate into bigger macroeconomic growth. So there's a lot that's been written that says, mobile phone penetration is associated with a 5% increase in GDP. And that's really hard to measure, because in order for us to measure that, we would have to be able to observe Niger or Ghana in the absence of mobile phones, which we just can't do unless you're in kind of some Hollywood world and you can observe these two states. So making these claims is going to be really difficult. Third, even though I think mobile phones are great, they're not going to be the silver bullet to development. Their development potential really depends upon these complementarities with other public goods, so roads, health services, and other market imperfections. I mean, if you think about it, if I know that prices are higher in a market that's 10 kilometers away, but I can't do anything about it because there's no road, or I don't have the money to get there, or even if I go there, I can't actually sell it because the market is structured in a particular way, that doesn't actually help me. I have better information, but I'm not necessarily going to be better off, and we'll definitely see different impacts for different groups. And finally, I would argue that we need I would encourage us all as we're working in this field to continue generating rigorous evidence, because we want to be looking specifically at successes and failures. I think that for every success we've seen, there's also probably been a failure. Unfortunately, we just don't hear about the failures too much, right? Because we don't have necessarily an incentive to report those failures, neither in academia or in the private sector or in the public sector. But I do think that the fact that mobile phones have been very highly adopted means that it can provide some really interesting lessons for other technologies. I don't want to say that mobile phones are anything like, insecticide-treated bed nets, but they offer some interesting lessons as to why people are adopting them, and is there something that we could do with some of these other technologies to mimic kind of mobile phones. And then we're working on some interesting stuff in the future that I'm happy to talk about afterwards, but thank you very much for your time.
Okay, so we now have time, and if you wouldn't mind, if you have a question, raise your hand, and then also introduce yourself, and then pose the question, please.
Hi, I'm Deborah Muller. I'm faculty here at Annenberg. Could you go back to the first bar graph on the results for ABC?
Mm-hmm. going to take a while.
Sorry.
So that's actually our
So let me
raw
start my
score.
question while you're doing that.
Okay, please go ahead.
So I assume those differences are significant, and it looked just by eyeballing it that the gap went down after 11 months than at 5 months.
Yep.
Do you know if that's a significant decrease in the gap, not in the total, but in the gap? And if the mechanism is what you were saying, I guess I would have thought that the gap would have been larger over time, because after the class ends, they would still be practicing.
Mm-hmm. So really good question. And so for both writing and math, if you look at the 5 month, that gap here, we actually ended up standardizing our test scores, but that gap is statistically significant for both writing and math. It's about 20 to 25% higher in the ABC group as compared to the non-ABC group. This is kind of an earlier version of these graphs, but if you look at it for math, about 6 months later, there's still a statistically significant difference, and the rate of depreciation is less in the ABC. For writing, they're higher, but there's not a statistically significant difference. It's marginal, and part of that, I think, is just due to the fact that people were using it, but they're only using it for kind of a limited number of reasons, right? They're impeded a little bit by how much they also want to spend on sending and receiving SMS messages. So yes, we only saw those kind of persistent skills or persistent effects for math, not for writing, at least in the short term. Yes.
Yeah, I'm Neil Schaff. I'm actually one of the faculty members from the Department of Orthopedic Surgery. What have you seen, I guess, sort of either locally down in Niger or any of these countries you've been to, what have you seen the impact of mobile phones on health? And more from the patient's perspective, or these consumers out in the villages as opposed to from health system trying to get access to them?
So I think we're talking a little bit about mobile medic, but the interesting thing that we've seen a lot in places like Niger or in Ghana are one of two things, which is number one, people are actually able to kind of, if they're trying to find healthcare in their local village and they can't, and they want to go to a health center, a big issue is often going to a health center and not finding the doctor or nurse actually there. So if you're going 40 kilometers away and you or other members of your village are actually going to pool resources to get that woman to the health center, you want to be darn certain that the person is there, because if not, you're just going to go to the nearest capital city, even if it's going to be 100 kilometers away, but at least you're going to find someone. And so what we've seen is that that's really nice, is that people can then call ahead and say, have you been there? Is the doctor or nurse actually there? If not, can we go to another health center? That works the other way, that if people are actually in that health center and they need to pay their bill, it can be quite difficult. You know, sometimes people they won't be stuck there, but depending upon the healthcare system, they might not be able to leave unless they've actually paid their bill and they're able to actually call home. The second thing that we've seen a little bit more formally with some of these mobile medic services is that it also allows kind of nurses or midwives who are working in the local village to call doctors and nurses and ask for support. Now that has been a little bit more formalized through NGOs who have kind of set up this system, but that's also been more informal as well, where they've been able to call and say, I have this case, what do you think about this case? So those are the two things that we've seen. The third thing that we've seen as well is reporting epidemics. So specifically meningitis in many areas of West Africa, that, you know, if the local kind of health agents aren't aware, then someone from the village will call the local health agents and say, we've observed this, and so you should get someone out here. So we've seen one of those three things that it's been kind of come up organically, and then obviously organizations have looked at that and said, hey, maybe we can actually do something about this. Yeah.
They're also used for community health workers to verify that people are taking their meds for HIV, and also for stockouts with medicine. And they're also, it's linking with radio and frontline SMSs is a combination that's very powerful, because the radio can reinforce that. On the air, you can say if you been to the clinic and they didn't have your medicine, text us when you went and what medicine you needed, and what can help us, that kind of thing. And Frontline SMS has developed a radio version of it specifically so that the radio stations can use this more effectively.
Yeah. Yeah, so that's extremely important, yeah.
They're using it a lot with governance. In Sierra Leone, during the elections, they were having people writing or texting in from each polling place we just, I'm with Phil Seaman with Developing Radio Partners, and we just provided training in Sierra Leone in preparation for the elections with 50 journalists. We trained trainers that then went and trained others with the independent radio network, and even teaching. I mean, in addition to how to organize debates and things like that, subtle things like tone of voice when you're talking about things can be prejudicial. And in I was just back from Rwanda, where one station had organized over 14 debates, public debates, live debates in the country on issues such as the rice growers felt that their co-op wasn't working hard enough to get the best price. So they brought the rice growers and the co-op people together and had this debate. And this was broadcast live. And other co-ops said, gee, I wonder about our guys, are they doing this? But they would get like 100 different text messages during the course of this. And when they have public officials on, they get a lot of questions out of it.
So I think that maybe you mentioned two things that I'd like just to build on, because we did something similar in Mozambique back for the elections in 2009, and there's so much power with that, but also there's some challenges, right? So if you have, people who are unable to read and write, then sending them text messages might not always, it's getting out there, but the question is, what impact is it actually having? And even if people are getting it, as you said, it's not just tone of voice, but do I trust where this information is coming from, right? So who's sending me this information, and why are they sending me this information? And so I think that these are things that are extremely, extremely important in order to see what impact they actually have. And I know that the stuff you've done in Sierra Leone really works on that. And that's some of the challenges that we had, is how do you send out this information to people who are unable to read and write, and how can we kind of convey that this comes from an honest, kind of objective source, as compared with someone who has a specific kind of alignment towards a political party.
Often the radio station is the most trusted institution in the community, and people go there with their problems to resolve them because it is impartial.
So one related question is, what's your sense of what the NGO community is doing, like CRS and others? Are they adopting mobile phones for development in any systematic or serious way?
So what I've seen, at least with many of the NGOs, is that they're using it for kind of two main mechanisms. The first one is collecting and disseminating data, right? So using iPhones or using other types of technologies when you go out with surveys to collect that data. That's the first thing. And then the second thing is then building it into some type of information dissemination service to send out this information in a more cost-effective way. That being said, and I'm not saying this is CRS, I think in general, these things are very complex when you're talking about behavioral change or getting access to information or trusting, or the way in which things are worded. And I think that a lot of the projects that I've seen throughout West Africa often kind of build the hardware without thinking a lot about the software, right? So how should things be said, or how should things be framed, or how often should people be getting these messages? But I've seen that the rate of adoption is quite high, right? But it's not across the board. It's usually built into particular projects, kind of standalone, one-off projects. But using it for data collection is something that a lot more people are doing nowadays.
So if I can just follow up on that,
Yeah.
one of the distinction you made, I think, is an important one that maybe hasn't been clear today, and that is who the end user is.
Mm-hmm.
So some of your examples were end user, the grain merchant.
Mm-hmm.
And the examples you gave from the NGOs, they were more intermediaries trying to collect data that could help them handle their own work.
Mm-hmm.
Is there a way that you conceptualize that in different ways? Are these two parallel strands going forward? How should we think about that?
No, I think it gets back maybe a little bit to Monroe's question about governance, right? So there's two things that if you can think a little bit about the way in which an organization or a government functions. So if it's highly inefficient, right, that information is not being shared, or it's really expensive to collect data or to disseminate information, they're just not doing as good of it. They're doing a good job, but they could do better, right? So by improving the efficiency of that system, hopefully at the end of the day, you're also going to be improving the impact on people's lives. that is then related to but separate from using these information devices as a way to like push out information to particular populations or provide content via the mobile phones in a more cost-effective way. So I think the first one is something that can improve efficiency of the organizations, improve people's lives. That can happen by itself. As part of that, you can also kind of bring into it or use it as a means to collect and disseminate information from kind of populations. And I think that what we've seen is that maybe they're a little bit separate, at least thought of conceptually differently, but I don't think that they're different. And we've actually been working with Frontline SMS. They're really interested in how Frontline SMS helps these organizations be more efficient. And then our argument is, but through your efficiency, maybe you're also helping to improve the impact on people's lives. And rather than kind of treat them as two separate questions or evaluation questions, can we build them together and evaluate that as a whole? Yeah.
Maybe you answered this, or maybe it leads to this, which is, what impact is there on, and can you differentiate among governments that you've worked on in terms of affecting government policy? What's the relationship between NGO take-up and government seizure of this and then implementation on a broader scale? And are governments capable or interested in moving from the NGO thing to government policy, other than Ethiopia, for example?
So if I went to broadly general, let me just generalize, which is, yeah. I mean, so obviously it depends upon, the government of the country. Like Rwanda has made huge investments into kind of mobile phone and mobile phone infrastructure. We've seen more take up at the NGO, public sector, that level, but I think it's also easier for them to fail, right? So in the sense that Ghana, for example, right now, they have a huge social welfare program, a cash transfer program called LEAP, okay? Which provides these ongoing cash transfers. It can be quite tedious because they're physically distributing the cash. They really want to use mobile money, but if they mess it up, that's kind of difficult for them, right? And so they are, what I've seen in Ghana is that they're super interested. They would like to do a pilot, but when they can look at how an NGO has done it to see what worked, what didn't work, what they have to learn, this allows them to avoid spending all of that time going through a pilot and implement it on a broader scale. So we talked to them a lot about our work in Niger, and we said, this is went totally wrong, and this is, if you were going to do it again in Ghana, this is what you would do. So I think it's a little bit easier, at least for these types of projects, for the NGO to go in there, do these small things to pilot and to fail. If you think about it, for the government, if they fail on a large scale, they've wasted a lot of money, you could affect your constituency, and it could also be kind of quite problematic for people having confidence in your services. And so I think that kind of makes sense. It also can be kind of a little bit expensive as well in order for them to invest in it. Yeah.
Hello, my name is Lorenzo Herron. I'm a visiting scholar from Michigan State University. I kind of have two stories, and a story and a question. In the summer of 2008, I had the opportunity to travel to India on a study abroad program with Michigan State. And we were kind of in the precipice of this whole mobilization of India. So there was this one particular time we were in southern India, in Coimbatore, I want to say, inside of this Hindu temple. And there was a Brahmin priest who was said to never step outside of the temple's corridors because he was bound to this particular place. So as we're going through the tour of this locale, he's talking with us. You just hear Justin Timberlake's "Sexy Back" come on his cell phone, and it just shows you the outstanding globalization. And I kind of use that as a framework for globalization, and you see how everything is interconnected, and you see even amongst this, supposed guy who's not even supposed to be in this global context is right there amongst it with all these modern features. So one of the things what we were doing there while we were there was working with mobile technologies and trying to implement the text message system with with mango farmers in southern India, so that they can supply it to a larger agricultural market, that being Coca-Cola at this time. And for me, I'm thinking of this as an agriculturalist because this is my foremost training. And so when I'm looking at the projects for mobile technologies, I see the risk for the negative feedbacks or the negative outcomes of it. So say if the Niger farmers, they realize that they can get a higher price on the grain that they're selling on the international market, and you have the global poor within this regional context that can't afford that regional or that international price. What are some of the systems and what are some of the research that's saying that, how do we kind of, subvert this kind of disastrous possible outcome to what we have, like what we're building up to, because that's kind of where the system is going, where in terms of we're getting all this information and what's directing farmers to different markets and stuff. But per my experience, I don't think the global poor will be able to afford the prices that the international market would dictate, and that's very problematic in the proliferation of this system. So is there research suggesting that this point is prevalent or contrary to the point, or what are some of your concerns, questions, and comments about that?
So I think, it's a really important question when you're talking about who's winning and who's losing. And I think if you take it out of mobile phone technology for a second, and you talk about the global poor, who are the global poor? Well, they're producers and they're consumers, right? And so during the food price crisis of 2008, prices shot up, which was really good for a lot of producers who were in many of these markets who could actually sell it at this higher price. It was really bad if you were a consumer living in Bamako and you had to buy that rice. So if you're a farmer living in, rural Mali and you could sell it for this higher price, that was great for you. But now you also had this higher price for these, urban consumers that they actually had to pay, and they were worse off. And so I would think that, as these markets become more integrated, these are things that are going to become more and more important, even outside of information technology and, the fact that this can improve access to information. I think what we could potentially do and what we're not doing now is this something that I mentioned called kind of a general equilibrium. So in many of these projects, we look at a partial equilibrium, which is like farmers get access to information, farmers sell more of their goods, they get higher prices and they're richer. Yay! But we don't ask the second question, which is, what about the people who aren't participating in the project? And what about the consumers who are living right nearby these farmers who also might be quite poor and now have to pay higher prices because basically, the farmers were able to sell it for a higher price. And so I think that the way that we can think about it is when we design projects, number one, try and understand how all these pieces are fitting together, and number two, try and at least help us to collect some data. It can be quantitative, it can be qualitative, to not just assess the impact on one group, but on both groups. But again, in the back of your head, knowing that if you let the market work, it's not going to be equitable. So if you want it to be equitable, there needs to be some type of governmental policy that allows it to be equitable, which in this case might be subsidized food prices, but the market by itself won't say everyone's going to be better off, right? There are probably going to be some winners and losers, and if that's unacceptable, then we need to do something about it and think about what we have to do about that. And that can take different types of forms. Yeah.
Okay, I think we really should, if people have other questions, I'm sure Jenny would be happy to stay back. We've kind of run over our time a little bit. Let us thank Jenny Aker, and it's been terrific.
Thank you so much.
So if you'd like to follow up, she's here for
I'm here.
more minutes.
Yes.
Thank you all, and
Thank you.
see you at the next